So everything's going well. I'm Greg Salmieri here in New York. Ben?
Yes, and I'm Ben Baer in New Orleans, and welcome to the Atlas Project. We're going to talk about Chapter 5, the climax of the Danconias.
So in this chapter, basically what happens is the chapter begins with Dagny Taggart coming into the office and learning from Eddie, who's just read it in a newspaper, that the San Sebastian mines have proved to be worthless. And recall that the background on this is that Francisco d'Anconia, who's a character we've started to get hints about in the last few chapters, bought these mines, this kind of big project. He didn't provide much evidence about the mines that would lead anybody to think that they were a really good deal, but he's got this reputation as a really shrewd player, and so people like Jim Taggart and Orrin Boyle rushed out to buy stock for the mines and begged it out of his hands, and moreover, Taggart Transcontinental got it into their heads to build, under Jim's direction, a branch line to Mexico. And in chapter 4, we found that all got nationalized, right? So all that got taken away. And now what we're learning in chapter 5 by the Mexican government is that it was the whole mines were worthless in the first place. And Eddie reads the story. He can't understand why this is true. Francisco is not an idiot. How could it happen? It's incomprehensible. Dagny has a sense that she's beginning to understand his motive, and she says, make me an appointment to see the bastard. We've already gotten indications that they have a past, and so this chapter occurs in two parts. Dagny's walking to the hotel to visit Francisco, and while she's walking, we get recounted her whole personal history with Francisco, and that's most of the chapter is this extended flashback, and then towards the end of the chapter, a little more than halfway through, Dagny actually gets to the room, and we see their kind of much anticipated encounter. So the flashback sequence goes all the way into the childhoods of these two characters, and Ben's going to start us out by talking a little bit about what we know about Francisco as a child. Getting some cutting in and out of Ben again. So Ben was talking about Francisco seems to have a kind of innate talent. He's able to effortlessly master everything he tries. But it's not only kind of innate abilities we get that Francisco is so good at things and seems to be so effortlessly. We also learn a lot about his perspective on things, which also seems to be unusual. Ben, I seem to have you back. Why don't you pick up there?
If I can. So at one point, Eddie asks Francisco, you're from some very great kind of nobility. And Francisco says, not yet. And what we get from this discussion, and there's a number of items planted throughout the chapter about this, is that Francisco doesn't think that nobility is innate, even though it just so happens that his ability is. And he gives the idea that there's something he has to earn about his nobility, about his greatness. For example, he talks about how he's a member of the aristocracy of money. And he says most people don't realize there is such a thing because they don't understand what the word aristocracy means, really. That's something we could maybe talk about. What does it really mean? Notably, he views himself as belonging to a kind of caste system, but he doesn't include James in it, even though he's the Taggart. He sees Dagny and Eddie as the ones who are the member of this kind of exclusive caste. And of course, Eddie has different background and lineage than Dagny and Francisco. And you also get him talking about how the symbol of nobility in this aristocracy isn't ancient coats of arms from medieval families, but industrial trademarks. And the last sign of this, I would say, is that there's a whole discussion, a whole exchange between James and Francisco about what it is that Francisco is after, and he answers money, and James wants to know why. And Francisco says, well, money is the price of admission into heaven, whatever the hell that is. And when James says virtue is the price of admission, we get the suggestion from Francisco that this isn't really a different thing, that making money and virtue are not distinct things. And so this gets to a topic that I wanted to discuss a little bit more with the audience online and also in New York about Francisco's motto, which is "What for?" Because I think understanding something about this motto is going to help us understand the way in which I think he sees people earning their virtue.
Ben, it sounds like you're talking about the "what for" motto as talking about how people earn their way into heaven or how they earn their virtue. It looks like your signal's good now. So,
but I was asking a question about where we see Francisco's purposiveness, where we see him acting on purpose. And so I'll just start by asking a few questions about some examples from his early childhood. So, for example, one of the first stories we hear about him is that he gets a job at Taggart Transcontinental. He has to break the child labor laws to do it. And why does he do that? And this is one of the first questions that Dagny asks him. And why would he do something like that? We get throughout this chapter that he could always name the purpose of his every random moment. He's portrayed as laughing at things because he sees something much greater. Dagny sees him as smiling at the future. And so we can apply this to some specific cases. If we take, for example, why does he get that job at Taggart Transcontinental? Why does he search through junk piles? He has answers to all these questions. Still not sure if anybody's hearing me. Why does he steal rides on trains, hang out in iron mills?
We have a few people wanting to answer here in New York. Mohammed?
So this is in relation to the question, why does he fix cars or why does he work in Taggart? Both? Mm-hmm. Well, when he went to work at Taggart, he was caught by Mrs. Taggart. His reason was that he just wanted to in a sense, beat Dagny, in the sense that he wanted to work at her rail before she did. But also he seems to just enjoy working and enjoy being really purposeful in that way. And then when Miss Taggart asked him to elaborate, he said that his father would honestly only care about whether or not he was really good at his job. So that seems to be an important part of his character. Later, when he was fixing a car, and the professor walked up onto him and told him he should be studying high culture, he responded with, "That's exactly what I'm doing," which seems to suppose that there's some grand thing he sees in the car that most people don't. They just see a pile of junk.
So as I'm understanding the points Mohammed was making, there are really several issues here. One is that he enjoys doing this kind of work. A second is that he's getting support for this kind of thing from his family. His parents, his father at least, approves of his being this way and approves of him having shipped out without telling him on a steamer for 3 months, which is a pretty interesting familial relationship. And finally, he has a fairly wide view of what counts as world culture, anyway, an unusual view, because when someone says, why aren't you out, learning about world culture when he's or reading in great libraries when he's examining wrecks of cars in a dump, he says, this is what I am doing, or what do you think I'm doing, which is indicates that he sees that kind of work, understanding how cars work and so forth, as an example of understanding the cultures of the world.
So Francisco does have a reason that he states for just about everything he does, including, most importantly, I think, his choice of career. Somebody asks him why he's studying the subjects that he's studying at university. All of them have to do with the fact that he's eventually going to take over Taggart Transcontinental someday. And so that is the main purpose that he's living for.
Or take over Danconia Copper.
Sorry, yes, that's of course what I meant. And Dagny sees Francisco connected in her mind to the future. She thinks of the future as like Francisco's smile. And herself is described as wanting to live in the future and living in the future most of the time, except for that 1 month of the summer when she sees Francisco. And so, Greg, I think that's maybe a good time for you to begin talking about Dagny's view of Francisco.
Okay, thanks. Let me put myself back on the screen. So yes, there's the question of what does Francisco represent to Dagny? And of course, they have a long-range relationship that goes through several different phases. So we could ask this at several points. But let's start when they're kids. What does Francisco represent to Dagny? Ben said the future. He's the one person whose event is whose coming is an event in her and Eddie's childhood. They rush down the hill or up the hill to meet him. What else does does Francisco represent to the young Dagny? How does she view him? Are there thoughts? I mean, that's, I think, a big part of it. For Mohammed?
Earlier on, we get this view of Dagny that she has a tough time emotionally bonding with any other person. So that the things she cares about, she doesn't seem to find anyone other than Eddie, perhaps, that cares about them in the same way or similar things. So he's also someone where there's just like a whole range of emotional complexities that earlier on it was implied that she didn't have with anyone else. Remember Jim's statement, she never felt anything. We see her feeling a lot of things with Francisco.
Yeah, that's an understatement ultimately, right? But yeah, so she doesn't, other people she doesn't think have any equivalent to what she feels for the railroad. Well, surely what Francisco feels for Danconia Copper is an equivalent to it. So he's the exception to that. Also, I mean, she's described in general as feeling boredom and contempt for the people and things around her. And Francisco is the shining exception to that. He represents something that's exciting, that's challenging. We had some good comments on this in the Facebook thread, that is the prior to the Today Facebook thread. Several people noted her seeing excitement and danger in Francisco, whereas he makes Eddie feel safe. He makes Dagny feel like something exciting and dangerous might happen. We had several people also who pointed out that there's a real competition between them from the very beginning. There's a race to get to the tree. Later on, we'll see who rises faster with their company. So there's a competition between them. The competition might suggest a kind of equality, or he's someone who's an equal in a way no one else around her is. Seth and Colleen both made this point online that she sees Francisco as an equal. There's something, though, that I think in a way she doesn't see him as an equal. Colleen also says that she idolizes him because he's everything that everyone else around her is not. And idolizing isn't something you quite do with an equal. In some sense, she puts him, she sees him as, even more profound, or she looks up to him. And I think it's significant here that Francisco is a few years older than her, right? So it's not exactly a peer relationship, at least not at first. So that's, I think, the main theme from Francisco early on. Okay. Now, Ben, you'll let me know if there's any comments, because I'm not looking at the comments of that are, I should be taking heed of. But let me ask, is there anything besides anything significant about her relationship with Francisco other than her excitement and enthusiasm? Any notes that are discontinent with that during their first several summers together? Did anybody have a sense of anything other than excitement she feels about him, respect, admiration, challenge? Yeah.
Doesn't she mention fear at one point? She's a little bit afraid.
She does mention fear. And what exactly... what is she afraid about? Can you characterize that? It's a little hard to get one's head around.
I think she's afraid of his power and how much he means to her, and it's scary for her even. And I think it's scary. It frightens her.
Okay, there's definitely fear, and I think there's more than one possible type of fear. So it sounds like what you're saying is she's afraid that she cares so much for him, and she's afraid maybe of what he'll do, or something like that. Or is it another kind of fear?
I don't think that she's afraid that he's going to hurt her intentionally, but I think it's almost like, I mean, this is aside from the sexual element, but
Before,
I think it's related. I think the fear is related with the sexual element.
Okay, so
that she feels.
there's some kind of fear or maybe sense of danger connected with their sexual attraction. But there's also, I think, a kind of element of fear we get earlier. Now, not so early that there couldn't be at least the beginnings of an attraction, but earlier than the summer or even right before when things are really starting to heat up between them. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, when the professor was visiting, sees Francisco, and he says, "Wow, no, I'm so sad that somebody could have that much joy in his face or in life because it's not going to end well."
Yeah, I think that's a really important in Dagny's psychology moment. So there's a professor who's observing Francisco and sees the amount of joy, his capacity for joy, and it's a world in which there isn't so much occasion for joy, and he thinks Francisco is somehow going to be hurt or something bad's going to come to him. And at the time when she hears that, Dagny, it seems ridiculous to her or whatever. It doesn't take it seriously. But the thought keeps coming back to her, and especially it comes back to her the summer when he's leaving to go to college. So he's with her for a month every summer, and at 16 he's about to enter college. It seems in this world people enter college at 16 pretty regularly. I don't know if that was more true of the time and place where she was writing. But anyway, it seems several of the characters enter college at 16. So Francisco was about to go into college, and she was afraid for him. She couldn't quite put her finger on what it was, but that episode of the professor and his worries kept coming back to her in that connection. So she was afraid of what exactly? That something he was going to encounter out in the adult world of college. This was the threshold, as she saw it, his going to college, from his childhood into his adulthood, was going to hurt him, break him, something. It's not clear what. But it's really significant to her because he is the one person in her life who represents the world that she hopes to grow up into, the kind of down payment on what she wants out of life that she's getting from life, or so to speak, or the premonitory signs of it. So the idea that when he goes out into the adult world, it's not going to go well for him or something's going to happen to him is really troubling for her. And when he comes back the following summer and all is well, it's this tremendous relief for her, right? And she didn't even need to know about the details of his life. And I think she gets this kind of great, he's the same, he's still Francisco, and it's still the world in which a Francisco is possible and that I can grow up into when he comes back at 17 and now she's 15. And this is a significant summer. So one thing Seth online wrote about this, I think this and also later when they were having their affair, is that their relationship lacks jealousy. She never worries about his location or friends or vice versa. And the first we're really told about this is him coming back at 17. He's back from college. And they don't talk a lot about what happened at college. Did you make any friends? How were the classes? Mostly bad, but there were a couple of good ones. We get very little. They don't talk very much about his life. They are all about his ambitions and hers and what's going to happen. And part of it is she doesn't feel the need to know. Their relationship is about the future. One thing it's worth noticing from this is she knows surprisingly little about his actual day-to-day life, like who are these friends and what classes, which is interesting as a plot point. But as a point about telling about their relationship, she has this, feels like she doesn't need to know. She gets him, and when they're together, they have this kind of bond that they have. Now, there's something else really significant that happens in this summer when she's 15 and he's 17. She's 15 and he's 17. There's a kind of heating up of their relationship. Where she looks at her a certain way and she feels uncomfortable. And there are a few scenes like this. But the biggest and the one that developed the most discussion online was the scene where they climb up a mountain or a hill to try to get a look at New York City. While they're there, they have some discussion in which she mentions that she's discovered why a lot of people don't like her. It's precisely because she's good and she's smart and she does well in school. Maybe she should just try to get D's for once and be the most popular person in class, she says lightly as a jest. And rather than laughing or saying, that would be funny or that's not a good idea, he seems shocked and hits her. So much so that she reels and, it draws blood, right, and gets a bruise. And he responds, did I hurt you as much, or she responds, did I hurt you as much as that? And this response is portrayed as knowing and sexy, and she's like a player in this kind of dynamic they have now, and not like a kid, because again, she's 2 years younger than him. So this is a striking and kind of troubling image. A lot of people find it's a very unusual image. And there was a lot of discussion online about this slapping scene. So does anyone here have any thoughts they want to kind of say about it? I've called a few of the comments online. But anyone in the room want to have any thoughts about what's going on in the scene, why it's here, what we're meant to take from it? We don't have any hands going up. Ben, is there anyone online who's talking about this now?
I mentioned that it happens, but there's not a lot of discussion about why or its significance yet. So right, I'm sure if we ask people to comment on it online, they'll start to over time, because it was a very popular topic on the group.
Sharks circle online and start commenting, and we'll throw out some more bait for. You throw out baits in the shark circle. Anyway, I'm lost in that metaphor, but I'll mention some of the things that were said about it in the Facebook chat. So Lisa, Doran, and Brian all brought it up and had a lot to say about it. Robin, I think you were in on this conversation for a bit, too.
I don't think I succeeded in convincing anybody.
All right, so let me just note a couple of things. So Cody says something that I think is significant, that I just want to read his comment or a part of it. He said, in a novel, sometimes things happen because the author believes they would have happened given the character that has been created. Skipping a bit. I suggest Rand might not have placed too much importance on how we judge the morality of that slap. What mattered as far as the story is that it showed Francisco's evaluation of Dagny's words, and it showed the kind of raw, honest relationship Dagny and Francisco once had. And I think however we evaluate the slap, and however we evaluate the technique of writing characters like this with these kinds of actions in it, I think it's definitely the case that the purpose of this scene is not to show that it's a good thing to sometimes slap women you're interested in if they say things that are disturbing or mess up your worldview, or that we should all aspire to relationships like this, or even that it's okay. The point of it in the scene is to show that this really got to Francisco, a guy who's usually so composed and controlled and nothing can faze him, and this broke his composure so much that it shocked and startled him that he had this violent reaction to it. Now again, whether that's a good way to react when you're startled and composed, and whether the author means that it is, and whether if she does, or she just thinks that, whatever, that's, I think, a separate question than what is the main point of this scene here. And I think it's that this had a kind of profound and stunning reaction on Francisco, and that his kind of first impulse was it hit him violently, and his first impulse was to react back violently. And then I think that's got to be the primary purpose of the scene. The thing that's primarily, I think, what's conveyed about the character, and that's how Dagny takes it, right? Did I hurt you as much as that? And then there's this kind of rivalrous intimacy between them over it. Yeah.
On that issue, I just thought it might be worth pointing out, because you said that there was a separate question of whether this is a good thing that's being portrayed and whether the author thinks it's a good thing. And I agree with you completely. And I think it's worth thinking about as specifically as regards to the question about the author's view of this, that Francisco is 17 years old in this scene when this is happening, and he has a lot of character development to go through yet. This is the beginning of the novel, and without saying anything more about what happens, it's just people should think about it. Is this the last we see of Francisco? What else might happen to him? When else might he face situations like this in the future, and what will happen then? That will be something to look for.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, whether it's whatever direction this is showing his development in, because it's a little hard to tell what's become of Francisco as he's grown. But I think the primary thing that's intended to convey by this is that this mattered to him and hurt him and troubled him in a way that very little else does. And then it's a separate question as to whether this is, I mean, if in actual life, right, if we saw some 17-year-old who responded this way to his proto-girlfriend saying something that messed with his view of him, we would not think well of it, and we might advise her, to be very cautious and so forth, or worse. A lot of people online were making the point that it's different because this is literature and there's some kind of symbolic way that this stands here. Brian was making that point a lot. Did you want to say something on this?
Well, there's also something sexual about it.
Mm-hmm.
Then we can't really go into the future relationships, but there's something very sexual about it, and she gets a lot of pleasure out of it. And she says, I'm never going to, don't wipe it off. I want to keep it. It's a badge of honor.
I hope it swells terribly.
Yeah. So.
Okay, so there's a kind of S&M kind of component to the relationship between Dagny and Francisco, and this is a kind of beginning of that. I think that's right. I do think insofar as we're taking this as, symbolic or exaggerated for fiction purposes, and this goes for any of the rough stuff in Sept, it's worth keeping in mind that how symbols like this are interpreted and what their meaning is objectively also depends on the cultural context at the time that the thing's being written. So right now, whether we're sensitive enough or a little too sensitive or just the right amount sensitive, we're a lot more sensitive to issues of sexual assault and violence against women than people were even 20 years ago, much less 40 or 60. And so if you're going to exaggerate something for a certain kind of effect or use violence as a symbol, the meaning of using it as a symbol is different in different contexts depending on how people are thinking about violence. And in a situation where we're particularly aware of a lot of unreported rapes, a lot of cases in which things seem like consensual or can seem to the one party like consensual sex, but they turn out not to be, or the person didn't really know she had an option to refuse or whatever. In a context where we're all thinking a lot about that and how to better deal with that in law, symbolism that's kind of ambiguous about consent or that's involving violence in relationships reads very differently than in a time when those concerns aren't at the forefront of everyone's mind. And again, whatever you think about these symbols, that difference, I think, is something to note. Al's got something he wants to say here. So.
I'm wondering if the slack and also much of their relationship has to do with their particular personality, their specific forms of exceptional achievement. Mm-hmm. I was thinking, well, suppose when Dagny was 12, she met a very bright guy who didn't read his English assignments. He would sneak off and do math, and that was his passion. Mm-hmm. He had no reason to jump on trains or take jobs in secret. His passion was to prove certain theorems. Mm-hmm. Chances are he wouldn't be as physical as Francisco was, and I'm wondering if there would be that attraction between the two of them.
Okay, so there's something, it's not just that Francisco's bright, or even that he shares some of her interests, because you picked math because that's one of the things that was one of Dagny's passions, right, from a kid, but there's what the interest that they share has to do with mastery over the physical world, and that's part of what's a bond between them. I think that's definitely true, and it's part of what attracts them to each other. Whether that translates to having a kind of rough physical type of intimacy rather than another type of intimacy, I don't know. That's you could interpret the characters either way. So anyway, that's, I think, all I want to say about the slap scene. I want to separate out the question of what is the point of this scene here from the question of how does she evaluate slapping someone like this. And then I want to, or much less how should we evaluate slapping someone like this. And then I want to, surely everything that happens in a novel is heightened and has some symbolic value. It is not like literally how you expect people like this would behave exactly in detail in real life. And then part of whatever we end up thinking, each of us, about using this kind of symbolism in this way, we should keep in mind that, her meaning of it is going to be colored by the somewhat different set of concerns about violence that were live at her time than the ones that are alive today, where we're are much more aware of the dangers of abusive relationships, I think, than she was. So before we get to the next kind of phase of Dagny and Francisco's relationship, which is 2 summers later when they consummate their relationship, we should talk about a significant formative experience for Dagny in the interim, which I'm going to cut to Ben for. Ben?
Yeah, so we spent a lot of time at the beginning, and I'm getting a little bit of an echo, Greg. We spent a lot of the time at the beginning talking about how Francisco was focused on being purposeful, was always looking to the future. Dagny emulated him to a good degree. She was living in the future, except for times when she would visit with him in the summer. We get a little bit more of an indication of what it's like for Dagny to live in the moment when we get to what you might call her coming of age scene. It's her first ball. She's 16. Her mother asks her while she's busy with work-related stuff, "Don't you ever want to have a good time?" And she says, "What do you think I'm having?" And so we get the sense that for her, work is life. And her mother's frustrated with this and wonders if her daughter has any kind of romantic ambitions whatsoever. And so her mother is surprised when she invites Dagny to the ball, to this, I guess, coming out ball, cotillion kind of thing. And Dagny accepts the invitation and seems to be delighted by the whole thing. And her mother says, "You see lights, colors, flowers, music. I want you to pay attention to these things. They're the kind of things that make life beautiful." And Dagny says, "I never thought that they were negligible." And so one question I want to plant for people to think about in the discussion is, given everything else we know about Dagny and what she values, and given especially that she's so often living in the future, dedicated to her career, what is it about lights, colors, flowers, music, the imagery associated with the ball that she does value? And I think that it'll be easier to answer that question when we look to see what her response to actually going to the ball is. Because she goes, and even though she was totally open to it and looking forward to it even, she finds that she doesn't enjoy it that much. And so why doesn't she enjoy it? That'll help us understand what it was she was looking for in the experience, because apparently she doesn't get it. So why doesn't she enjoy this ball? I'll leave this for the people online and anybody in New York who wants to speculate about it. We see that she,
here want to talk about that?
She shows up. She's wearing an elegant gown. She looks daring. Her mother thinks that it's from another century when bearing one's bare shoulders would have been an act of rebellion, when it would have had meaning. But for some reason, for Dagny, it doesn't end up having the meaning that she wants. And so Corey online says, well, she doesn't find people to relate to. Judy says that she can't relate to the men or the women there. Brian says she hoped the people would match the setting. So yeah, the common theme we see here is that the people who are showing up, I mean, the lights and the flowers and the music and everything, they're great, but the people who are showing up don't seem to match in some way. And at one point, she actually tries to explain herself because her mother sees her feeling rather dejected about the whole thing, kind of slumping in a corner somewhere. And she says that the lights and the flowers, did they expect those things to make them romantic, not the other way around? And so that tells us something, I think, about why it was Dagny was looking forward to enjoying this ball, what it was about the flowers and the lights, and etc., that she was looking forward to enjoying. Does anybody want to speculate about what and why? And because she's not getting it, what is it that
We have
she's saying?
We have something here. So,
Okay.
all right, let me just set the audio up. Okay, go ahead.
She hasn't found any worthy suitors of anybody in the audience of the boys that show up to be worthy of the flowers in the room or of her, because she's on the same level as the beauty of the flowers and the lights and the spectacle. She is the same. And no one appreciated. She calls them all boys, and she could squash any of them. You know, she's sitting on the rail at the end in her ball gown, like a cowgirl, and she says, "I could squash any of them, and they're not men."
You can squash 10 of any of them, even worse.
Yeah, Greg, Doran. Beauty shouldn't replace goodness, but highlight or augment it. A beautiful dress can make a beautiful woman look lovely, but a hag will not be made elegant by it. And Doran, I take it that you're not just talking about the physical beauty of the people who are wearing the dresses, though that could also be a factor, but something about the kind of character that these people have, and the material accoutrements, they're fitting and proper expressions of this underlying character. And so when you're a good person, you've done good things, you've got something to celebrate, and you use these material tools to do that celebrating and to express that achievement. But if you're not, there's not so much worth celebrating. And I think that's going to connect us up to some of the themes that will come up in the next big segment that Greg's going to discuss. And Greg, I think you also wanted to comment on how Francisco reacts to Dagny's recounting of the story of her ball.
Yeah, well, that's an interesting element, Francisco's reaction. So she tells him the story, right, when he comes the next summer. This is now the summer she's 17 and he's 19. And he looks at her. She gets the sense that he's hearing more in her words than she means to be telling him. So that's already interesting. He understands the significance of this story in a way that she doesn't, or this disappointment she felt in a way that she doesn't understand. And he looks at her with his derisive, mocking smile, which he is usually reserved for other people. So he finds something. There's something significant here. He sees more to it, and I think we can speculate as to what it is that he's seeing. I mean, he understands better than she did what she wanted from this. And in this summer, we had it a little bit in the previous summers, a sense that he's aware of her sexuality in a way that she isn't quite yet, including, and she's becoming aware of it through him and through their interaction. And this makes sense, again, that he's a little bit older than her. And there are several scenes, particularly on her 17-year-old summer, where she's, I think, clearly feeling sexual frustration or sexual desire and hasn't quite articulated to herself that that's what it is. She's with him and she feels this kind of restlessness and she's just got to leave, and he looks at her knowingly. And this, of course, builds to this tennis match that they have, where she's furious at him and has to defeat him, and he's throwing his shots wildly just to make it harder for her, and eventually wins. She wins the match, and he kind of throws his racket down at her feet in a gesture of acknowledging her victory, but that somehow suggests that, he's really won all along in some way. So, I don't know. Does anyone have any thoughts on the kind of insights into her sexuality or what Francisco is to her that we get from the tennis match before we go to what happens the evening of the tennis match? So anyone here want to make any comments on the tennis match before we move to the evening? Mohammed?
Just a general comment, not just about her and Francisco, but her and Reardon when things got a bit, kind of similar in the last section. That for Ayn Rand, the sexual component seems to kind of go hand in hand with a type of like adversarial guy versus woman. There's some conflict they in the book they wildly disagree on, and then there's kind of like a tension between the two that's both sexual and conflicted in another way.
Yeah, so Mohammed's pointing out that some of us sensed some sexual tension between Dagny and Reardon in chapter 4. Nothing happened there with them. They didn't, play tennis. But there was a kind of verbal sparring over a deal they were doing, and some language that suggested enjoyment of that. And in her other novels, too, at least also in The Fountainhead, somewhat in We the Living, not really in Anthem, but there's a kind of adversarial dynamic to her romantic relationships. And that's clearly part of just either whether it's her view of romance or it might just be her kind of literary sensibility that she likes to heighten the drama of whatever plot conflicts there are by pairing them with conflicts among characters who have strong feelings for each other. It's definitely at least part of her literary style and technique. All right, so that Francisco comes to her at the Rockdale station. They walk back in the morning when she's coming back from her job. They get to a clearing in the woods. He grabs her by the arm. She thinks, don't ask me for it, and so forth. And they have sex. He initiates it. She's clearly willing and eager. She's the one who starts kissing him and pulls his head down to kiss her and so forth. So there's, unlike a similar scene in The Fountainhead that's written to be, I think, more ambiguous, or I think ultimately not, but she's much more actively taking part and making this happen than in the corresponding scene some people have raised online in The Fountainhead. But nonetheless, part of her view of this is that he just does it. And it's important to her that whatever kind of permissions are needed were given in advance and he could read them. And that's another thing that people might, some readers I know are uneasy about, particularly in light of some of the kinds of discussions we're having in the world now about sexuality. But let's leave aside the kind of consent issues. And they have this very passionate sex, right? And afterwards, presumably it's the first time for both of them, we're told. And he says, we had to learn it for the first time from one another. And then they continue to have an affair throughout the rest of the summer, and indeed for years going forward. But does anything stand out about their sexual relationship or their attitude towards sex? Are there any comments there that, anything there that anyone wants to comment on? Remember that Jim and Betty Pope, their night together, and indeed their relationship, is described as there's no passion there, not even any pleasure. They've heard that men and women were supposed to sleep together, and so they did. So I think now, having Francisco and Dagny's backstory romance in mind, we can have more of a sense of how Rand conceives of what's missing from the Jim and Betty relationship, and in particular how she understands this idea that they're having sex because they're supposed to. And in fact, they're just going through the motions, but the feelings that go along with those motions, or that made sense of those motions, or that would lead someone to come up with in the first place the idea that that there should be such a thing as sex, or that people should do it, are missing from Jim and Betty. So what is it in Dagny and Dagny and Francisco's case, that what does sex mean to them? Yeah.
Well, first of all, they don't have any guilt about it. Either one of them don't have any guilt at all.
Mm-hmm. No
So,
guilt. Yeah.
Dagny says she has a feeling greater than happiness, the feeling of one's blessing upon the whole of the earth, and the feeling of being in love with the fact that one exists and in this kind of world. The concept of pain had been wiped out. And that's like totally opposite of any, the Harlequin
All right, so
outfit.
there's yeah, okay. So there's no guilt, first of all. And then what's the other thing? The feeling of pain has been wiped out, and one other thing
It says that nothing could be grave in a universe from which the concept of pain had been wiped out.
Good. Will, did you want to?
Yes, and it relates very strongly to what he says to her at the end of the chapter, where he says, "I still want to sleep with you, but I'm not happy enough to do it."
Yeah.
And that shows that his way he experiences sex is indeed very different from the way Jim does.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. So sex is coming from a place of happiness for Francisco. So much so, we're not sure yet why he's so unhappy or not happy enough at the end of the chapter, but it's so much coming from a place of happiness that he's not able to or willing to do it or doesn't want to do it in a situation where he doesn't have the kind of feeling he had when he was a young man and with her.
Separate the sexual act from his emotions.
Good way of putting it. He can't separate the sexual act from his emotion. But you could have different emotions, like an emotion of needing to make up for something, or an emotion of desperation that comes from that you're plumbing the depth of despair. But it's a particular emotion. It's this kind of feeling of happiness. And Dagny has this thought that she had thought of times when there was a kind of something she wanted to express and didn't know how to, and she had learned the act now by which you express it. And it's a certain kind of emotion towards life in general, as it's described, or towards the universe as such, being in love with one's life, a kind of happiness in a deep and overflowing sense. Al?
Also, Dagny apparently assumes, and maybe doesn't even consider, that the relationship might not be exclusive. It's just assumed that she never wondered whether he was true to her or not. She knew he was.
Yeah, good. So this comes up more after the summer when he leaves to go up back to college, and they don't see each other much over the course of the year. They do occasionally. He comes and they get together, but in that period, while he's at her house all summer, she can keep tabs on him maybe. But when he's back at college and they're seeing each other occasionally, you might think that a woman would be worried about the fidelity of her boyfriend, especially a guy who she doesn't know hardly anything about his day-to-day life, it turns out. But she's not, and the reason that she's not is because she knows that casual encounters or promiscuity is possible only to what sort of people, does she say?
Only to those who regarded sex and themselves as evil.
Yeah. So maybe evil, evil is the word that's used. So only to people who regard sex and themselves as evil. If that strikes you as too strong to get your head around at first, try contemptible. Right? People who have contempt for sex and themselves, which I think is not that far apart from evil, but people use evil in somewhat different ways. Yeah. So start with the idea of contempt. It comes from a place of contempt for yourself and for the sex act. Maybe even worse than contempt, regarding it as evil. At least that's Dagny's initial view of this at 17. So let's talk a little bit. Yeah, Ben.
If I could chime in a little bit here, Corey in the chat, I think, also adds an interesting point to this discussion, which is that something about the way sex is being portrayed here is portraying it as an ultimate value. Now, I'm not quite sure what Corey means by that, but it's perhaps related to something that I thought was worth commenting on anyway in this section of the book, because everything we've talked about up until now, or a lot of what we've talked about up until now, has been the role of purpose, ultimate value, ultimate purpose. Francisco and Dagny are both working for the future, and a lot of what they're doing that separates them from everybody else is a means to an end of some distant future where they're going to be running their respective industries. But I think it is incredibly interesting if you look carefully, and I only saw this on like my 6th or 7th reading of the book, about how in this scene there is language and imagery that's got to have been deliberately chosen for the purpose of conveying the idea that what's going on here is not a means to some future end, but is instead a way of living in the moment and living life as an end in itself. Because you have, when Dagny's in the Rockdale station, just before Francisco shows up, she's turning off her lamp, watching the vast, soundless motion of light over a motionless earth. Things stood still, not a leaf trembled on their branches. All the train traffic has stopped. And then when she and he leave the station together and they're going into the woods, it seemed, and this is on page 107 of the standard edition, it seemed natural to the moment's peculiar reality that was sharply clear but cut off from everything, immediate but disconnected like a bright island in a wall of fog, the heightened, unquestioning reality one feels when one is drunk. And later, the leaves hung still, they walked alone to move through a motionless world. And so there's a lot of emphasis here on this is not something that's for the future. This is now, but at the same time, it's not seen by either of them as in conflict with their attitude toward the future. And there's a sense in which the future is now. And so this is something to think about when you're considering, well, what does it mean for Francisco to always be asking what for, and what doesn't it mean?
So you're saying it doesn't mean that he's never able to live in the moment, but it means that what?
It certainly doesn't mean that. Now, Corey actually just corrected me to say that he thought that he meant to say that Taggart Transcontinental was her highest value. And I mean, Corey, I think you're right about that. And so the thing to wonder about is, well, okay, so does this mean that this sex is just a means to the end of her someday becoming the president of a railroad? Because that doesn't seem right either. So what is the relationship between their sexual values and their professional values? And I think it goes back to what we were discussing in regards to the ballroom scene. And Dagny doesn't only care about her work. She also seems to value the lights and the flowers and the beautiful things. Does she just value them as a means to the end of her career, or is it something else that's going on here? That's all I had on that, Greg.
All right. Well, why don't you take us? No, I don't think I have anything more I want to say about that now. I think we can go. I'm just keeping an eye on the time. A little bit late because of the AV problems that interrupted us. Do you want to talk a little bit about their relationship as it continues after that first summer? We already talked about the issues of there not being jealousy and her not feeling the need to know that much about him because she knows what kind of a person he is. But there are some other things to talk about.
We did, and so they do end up, having to separate on occasion, and sometimes they go the better part of a few years without seeing each other. Francisco, in his characteristic way, shows up at unexpected times, and this is in keeping with what it is that Dagny likes about him, because one of the things that he makes her feel is excitement and danger, and when's Francisco going to show up next? But what she knows he's up to is he's graduated from college, and he's now working for Danconia Copper. He's working his way up basically from the floor. His father doesn't want him to rise too fast. And at one point, Dagny remarks that when she looks at the way he runs his business, it's not too different from the way he was driving that motorboat that she saw him driving in his youth, where he was, completely confident and in control and completely, full of ability. But in spite of that, it seems like Francisco is not always totally confident and totally serene in the way that she loved about him. You know, that smile looking at the future is not always on his face. And we get an early hint of this, and then we get more of it building up until the end of the chapter. And so I'll just point out that at one point when he comes back to visit in New York, she notices him looking at the city with this look of bitter, helpless anger. And he says, go ahead.
That's just something that's striking. I mean, because have we seen bitter and helpless together before in the novel? Not in Francisco. In anyone else? Helpless is a word that just doesn't seem to fit him. Who else doesn't helpless fit as a word? There's a character, and it's Dagny herself, who we see her first time ever feeling helplessness and despair. Now, it's not quite bitterness, but we're getting something really out of character for Francisco in this moment, at least for the Francisco she knew. And something that's also out of character for her, Dagny, but that she is starting to experience in the present tense in the novel. And so that's something striking. And it's striking, too, because Dagny had this idea that Francisco, she had this worry from childhood about, could the world break him? Could somebody with his kind of capacity for joy, is there something the world could do to that kind of a person, like this professor thought? No, of course not. He came back from college. He was fine. But now he's older. He's not yet in charge of Danconia Copper, but he's running the New York office. And she sees signs of this, that the world can get to him. He's not impervious.
Yeah, and so that's like the first hint, I think, we get of something changing about Francisco. We get more of it in basically what is their last meeting for quite a while at this Wayne Falkland Hotel, the very hotel that Dagny is going to meet Francisco in the present date. You know, we're all still in the flashback here, but in the flashback, they have their last meeting there. And it's, again, he's looking bitter and tortured, and he doesn't want to talk about work, which is very uncharacteristic of him. The Halley's Fourth Concerto, which I believe at this time had just been written, comes on the radio in the restaurant, and Francisco is struck by it. And if you think back to our conversation about the Fourth Concerto last time, it's probably significant. And we talked about what the significance of that music was for Dagny, if you remember, when she was sitting alone in her apartment and then happened to see the story about Francisco in the paper. He asks her what she would do if he asked her to leave Taggart Transcontinental. And she says, well, why don't you just ask me what I would do if I were to commit suicide? And then they proceed to have a long kind of tortuous night together. She sees him in resignation and unbearable pain. He says, I can't give it up. Help me to remain, to refuse, even though he's right. And she wants to know, refuse what? And he doesn't answer. But then somehow he's composed himself in the morning, and he looks like a man who sees that which makes torture worth bearing. And he gives her this ominous warning that he's going to do things that she's going to damn him for. And very soon we find out what those are. I don't think I had any questions that I wanted to ask people about in regards to that scene, but I guess if somebody has any questions or wants to make any comments before we turn it over to Greg, we can see if anybody has anything about that. Anybody in New York want to say anything about that scene?
Looks like people are silent about it.
Okay.
All right, in that case, let's talk about what happens after this. I mean, we have this night together. Colleen online had a really nice description of it. But she sees him in a way she's never seen him before. Not only was there this bitterness in this previous thing, but he actually begs her for help, right, the one moment during that night. And then he's mysterious and ominous, as Ben put it, the next day. And he says, you'll want to damn me. You won't want to see me the next time you hear me. So how does Francisco change? And I think Brian online had a really nice answer to our description of how is the young Francisco and the old Francisco different. So let me just read a few phrases from his. In his youth, Francisco is a man of superlative intellect and ability. He's ambitious, and his most distinguishing characteristics are his supreme regard for the value of work and for the value of purpose. I think that's a really good description by Brian. There's nothing important in life except how well you do your work, he tells Dagny at one point, right? Then Brian adds, he seems to have, of the older Francisco, he seems to have abandoned his earlier ambitions, as he only engages in business deals sporadically, and he's not enacting a long-range plan to double the value of his company, which is his goal that he told Jim when he was younger. But he still appears to have the intelligence and ability that he always had. Again, I'm quoting Brian. We could see this in how well he plays the marbles, and in that there seems to have been some kind of intelligence or crafting behind the San Sebastian situation. At least whether or not he intended it, and Francisco is kind of cagey about that, he's very aware of what the downrange consequences will be and seems to have strong views about them. He says, you think this won't happen, but this will, to Dagny. So he has a view of what's going on here. A few things to note about the change in Francisco. First, I think Brian's right to point out that he engages in business ventures sporadically. He's spending most of the time devising frivolous and weird parties, right, and melting ballrooms and so forth, which Dagny finds depraved. But he engages in business only occasionally. Did anybody notice anything about the sporadic business deals he engages in? What their consequences are? I mean, one thing that struck me about them is it's pointed out that these deals are spectacularly successful and ruin competitors. It was never part of what we knew about. I mean, think about Dagny's attitude towards competitors in Dan Conway, right? She thought that both she and Dan Conway could do well in Colorado. She wasn't out to ruin Dan Conway, but she thought, if I have to, I will. If it turns out there's only room for one railroad here, I'll compete you, and if I beat you, I won't care about it. But it's no part of her drive to ruin him. And yet the common denominator between Francisco's few sporadic business ventures is that or at least the only one we're told, besides that they're successful, is that they ruin competitors, which is interesting, and does suggest that he's on some kind of destructive course, which is part of what Dagny thinks. And then the other thing, of course, about him during this period is he's now become a playboy, it seems, given to frivolous affairs and encounters and, getting women naked and melting ballrooms by giving them furs and stuff. Very opposite to someone who she couldn't have imagined cheating on her, or indeed being with anyone who he didn't have a very serious feeling for. Maybe she was wrong about him all along, but he just didn't have a casual attitude toward sex, and he seems now to really have one. So that's striking. And then, of course, there's the San Sebastian deal, which we'll talk more about when we talk about the conversation between Dagny and Francisco in the present. One thing that's interesting here is Dagny's how Dagny deals with this pain, or deals with this, tremendous shock, right? We see her very upset about it. We see her sobbing when she's listening to the Fourth Concerto and looking at Francisco's picture in Chapter 4. This is a big deal to her. And this is the only man she's had in her life, right? We're told how Dagny deals with it, and Maury online points out that that Dagny doesn't believe in suffering, doesn't allow pain to become important. She has sorrow, she has pain, there are things that hurt her. I don't think she denies that they do, but she fights against making them, she fights against something about them. And Will, it looks like you've got something you want to say on that. No? Okay. So this is sounding again like the fourth concerto, right? The idea that pain, okay, it's real, there's some pain in the world, but it's not necessary, it's not important, it's not the essence of life. You shouldn't regard it, or there are people anyway, people like the Halley of the Fourth Concerto, people like Reardon we earlier thought was like this, and now we're seeing Dagny is like this, who, when they experience pain, they in some way fight against it or fight not to see it as important, not to let it be part of their worldview, but to see it rather as a kind of accidental feature. And it takes a real struggle, it seems, for Dagny to do that. But it's because she's able to do it that she's able to recover and get over this episode with Francisco. Go ahead.
Dagny feels that it is not to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
Not to be taken seriously. An immovable certainty within her kept repeating, pain and ugliness are never to be taken seriously.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny Ayn uses the word immovable after the name of
After the immovable
others.
mover chapter.
Yeah. And then it's not to be taken seriously, of course. So she has to, this is like her mantra. She has to keep repeating it to herself in order to deal with the disconnect of not understanding Francisco's motives.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's both something that's very important to her, an important part of her character, but as I say, it's a mantra. She has to work at it, saying it to preserve this perspective. So it's a important to her but hard-won perspective. And she's reflecting on all of this on her way, right, to visit Francisco. I mean, we get the sense that she's walking there. She feels that she's walking like she's going to see Francisco. She should be running down the hill to him. But she's then kind of rehearsing the whole history of their relationship. And by the time she gets there, she's kind of steeled herself to see him again. Francisco, who she now has a very different view of. She told Eddie, when she called him a bastard, tell that bastard I want to see him. He said, but it's Frisco d'Anconia. And she says, it was. And now she's about to enter the room and confront him. And over to you, Ben.
Yeah, so Dagny has come to the hotel for a purpose. She wants to ask him a very specific question, and the specific question is, why did you come to New York? Was it really for the veil divorce? But the reason she wants to know about that is a bigger question, the question that's been bothering her while she's been walking here, which is, why is Francisco being the way he is? Why? And she even at one point thinks it's unexplainable. No possible explanation. It makes you want to think she's about to say, who is John Galt? But she's still going to try to find out. And what I want people to start talking about or thinking about, both in the chat and in New York, is what can we tell right now, as of this chapter, about why Francisco is doing what he's doing? And I'll give you some material to work with to think about that question. So one thing we find out immediately from Francisco is that he says he didn't come to New York actually to hear about the veil divorce. He came to see the San Sebastian disaster, or the aftermath of it, to see the way various stockholders would react. And he readily admits to the fact that he knew the mines were worthless, that he would lose millions of dollars when this was discovered and when the mines were nationalized by the Mexican government. And he also admits to the fact that he wants his American stockholders to lose this money. And so Dagny's theory at first is that he's just depraved, that he stopped getting his kicks out of giving furs to women in melting houses and is moving on to some other kind of depravity. And it's seeing these people lose money. But we very early, very quickly, we get some information that is at least a counterindication to this explanation. There's things that he's saying, and there's things that she's observing about him in the scene that don't quite fit with that theory. And so what are some of the things that don't fit with it?
So it looks like Mohammed's got a thought on this. Should we start there while the internet heats up, or is the internet already talking to us on this?
No, he can start.
All right, so Mohammed?
So, as far as what's incongruent about the depravity, I don't have much to say about that, but what I will say is that everything he does, whether it's his business deals, the ones that get rid of competitors, or messing up the San Sebastian line, or poorly constructing the village where the workers say, his end goal seems to be the economic ruin of specific people. And at first it might be that, it's just the moochers who he's trying to, or the people who are like Jim and his friends and just tagging along, and the Mexican government, but also the competitors that he's against, which aren't necessary. We never have any indication to suggest that they're people like Jim. They could very well be people like Dan Conway, like him, not him specifically. So he's just out for there's a sense in which he's out just to kind of ruin them economically. Whether or not it's depravity, that's what Dagny thinks, but I don't think it's clear now what the exact reason why he wants that.
Okay, so the idea is he's out to destroy different people at different times economically. He's out to make them lose money. He's out to create ruin of these competitors, now of all the American investors in the San Sebastian line.
One more thing, it's not as if he's renouncing the things he said before. He names the mines after his ancestor. And then Dagny brings up, didn't you say you want to do a great honor to your ancestor? He says, of course, I'm still doing that. So in some way he sees what he's currently doing as part of the same zeal he had when he was younger, whereas Dagny thinks it's a treason to those ideals, but that's where they disagree.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. Ben, thoughts on that?
Yeah, so we have some people saying online, look, there's all these observations that Dagny is making of Francisco that seem to, he still seems to be the same old Francisco. He still seems to be excellent in his ability at shooting marbles. Everything from that to his smile, he's sort of joking about it when he says, maybe I just made a bad job of it. I slipped up. I'm human, as he's expertly shooting a marble across the room. And so first of all, there's just evidence about Francisco's character. It doesn't seem like it's changed. And so how could it be that it's just depravity on his part? And furthermore, what do we find out about Mrs. Vale? We find out that there's a contradiction in the story about how she was supposed to be having an affair with him, because actually at the time she says it was happening, Francisco is having his picture taken at the opening of the San Sebastian Railroad. So it turns out he's not having that affair, which raises questions about the reputation that he's developed over the years. And also at one point when he's talking about how he's been able to make so many of these American stockholders lose money, Dagny asks him, does this amuse you that they trusted you so well to put all this investment in your name? And he says, no, it doesn't amuse me. And I don't talk about such things as trust and honor anymore. And so
in general, the issue of what does and doesn't amuse him is interesting. If you look, he's in general amused, but he's often saying, I don't find this amusing. I find this much more amusing than that. And if you're trying to get a read on what Francisco is up to, and it can be hard to do even if you've read the novel several times to get the real subtleties of it, what is it that amuses him and what is it that doesn't? I don't think we should try to answer that question now, but for multiple time readers, it's worth looking into that.
Well, I actually wanted to mention a few things about it anyway on that very topic, because, what's confusing to Dagny is, especially when he's making this joke about maybe I just made a bad job of it, maybe I screwed up, I'm human, etc., is she she can't understand this, and he's amused by the fact that she can't accept him as a bum. And at the same time, he's amused that people assume he wanted always to make money. There's a lot that we get at this point in the conversation where it looks like he is being purposeful. There is some purpose he's going after, but it's not money. And it's not just that he made a bad job of it, because he describes in very intricate detail just exactly what he thought the consequences of this action were going to be, and the kind of chain reaction that it looks like he was hoping to accomplish. Like, he was going to destroy $40 million of Taggart transcontinental wealth, and that was going to help destroy the Phoenix Durango, and then Ellis Wyatt would be the next to go. And he's very amused by this, that his plan seems to be coming off without a hitch. And of course, this just frightens Dagny even more. In her mind, probably she's thinking, wow, he's even more depraved than I thought. But he does say one thing to try to explain, to try to reconcile the incongruity here. And it's probably a pretty significant passage. I don't know if anybody caught what his explanation was, but it connects to this whole theme of purpose that we've been talking about through much of the evening. He says, whether I did it on purpose or through neglect or through stupidity, don't you understand that doesn't make it any difference? The same element was missing. And this is a purely rhetorical question, which we are not going to discuss, but it is, people should think about what is this element that is missing that he's talking about. And so that's all I had on that section. Greg, did you want to talk about the wrap-up of it?
Just a few thoughts on that. Also, Muhammad, I think, suggested a little earlier what his purpose seems to be, that it seems to be to destroy people or destroy them economically, maybe different people at different times. Maybe he's progressing from one to the next. Maybe now he has a more ambitious plan of destroying people by these chain reactions from the San Sebastian project. But one thing that I thought was significant, Mohammed, in what you said, is that he sees this destructive purpose as somehow in line with or as similar to the purpose of doubling San Sebastian copper that he had when he was younger. He says, you've never had an unsuccessful investment. Well, investment depends on what it is that you're trying to achieve, and it's by putting in by himself losing a fairly small amount of money, or comparatively small amount of money, 40 million, he wiped out all this wealth belonging to all these other people. So he's out to destroy wealth, it seems, and he sees this being out to destroy wealth as a continuation in somehow consonant with his earlier purpose. And indeed, Dagny says, and somebody noted this on the chat a few moments ago, that Dagny brings up the name of the mine, San Sebastian, and he says, I named it after him. It's the San Sebastian mines, Sebastian d'Anconia, and I think he would have appreciated that. And Dagny has her first sense of blasphemy when he says that. She's never experienced what people meant by that before. So somehow Francisco, incongruously to Dagny, sees this destructive binge or something that he's on, as she sees it, as a continuation of the purposefulness of his childhood and a continued loyalty to Sebastian d'Anconia. And in the web discussion, some people suggested ways in which this might be the kind of thing Sebastian d'Anconia would approve of, connected to how he dealt with the Lord of the Inquisition. Two more general elements of this scene to mention, and then I want to talk about another aspect of it. One is, well, really just one. She, why don't you should be fighting the looters, is what she thinks, right? If you recognize these people are bad, and you want to make them lose their money. Although he also seems to want to make Wyatt and other people lose some money, and he says, no, it's my dear, it's you that I have to fight. So why is that? We don't get an answer, but. And in trying to understand how he could have been this way, she says, you're not the kind of man who gets broken by any kind of world. And here we see the issue that she had at 14 when he was going off to college at 16. Could the world break him? No, he came back intact. He's not the kind of man who could be broken by any kind of world. And yet he's doing something that's only explicable to her as a result of him having been broken, maybe by that kind of bitterness and anger she saw in him and helplessness when he was starting out in business. But his response isn't, well, I was broken, I'm sorry. It's true. He isn't the kind of man who could be broken by any kind of world. Then why? Asked Daphne. And this is our only time in this chapter when we get the question, who is John Galt? This time from Francisco. And, along with the who is John Galt, that she's not ready to hear the answer to the question she's looking for. Another element of this scene that we haven't discussed, but that fits with what we were discussing earlier, which is there's a really frank acknowledgement of their sexuality and their attraction to each other throughout the scene. She comes in dressed in business attire, right? And he says, if you came like that not to let me notice how lovely you are, you know, you're lovely, Daphne, I noticed anyway. I forget the exact phrase. She is noticing him on the floor, shooting the marbles, and noticing the lines of his body and what she could see of his skin under his shirt. And she's thinking about his body under his clothes and remembering the excessive acts of intimacy and still feeling pride about it, despite having now some kind of, thinking he's a horrible person now, still feeling pride, but a kind of distant pride at her ownership or one's ownership of his body. And then there's the line that, Will, you quoted earlier, I still want to sleep with you, but I'm not a man who's happy enough to do it, which is a really puzzling line in its own sense. It's followed by, you want it too, don't you? And she's tempted to say no, but what she says is, yes, but it doesn't matter to me that I want it, which fits with this idea of still feeling the attraction to him, still feeling pride in her ownership of his body, but it being distant, her being kind of set apart from it. So, I don't know, there's much more to say about that, but just noticing this kind of echo of their sexual relationship in the present. All right, so I think, Ben, we could probably afford to go for maybe 10 more minutes or so in light of the making up time for the tech problems we had. Do we have any other topics people on the chat want to talk about, or we have a few miscellaneous ones?
Kali on the chat, I thought, made an interesting comment about Francisco's purpose. Kali says, he is only out to destroy wealth that is unearned through honest work and trade. Well, you might get that if you're just looking at the fact that Francisco wants to go after people like James Taggart and Oren Boyle. But what about Dagny? What about the fact that he wants to fight Dagny? And he says that. And so there really is a mystery here as to what his purpose is. And somebody else in the chat, Brian, said his purpose is figuring out his purpose is part of the mystery here. And that's one of the things that I myself find so interesting about Francisco. And when I read this book the first time, I thought he was the most fascinating character for this reason. It's not just Dagny that he wants to fight, right? When he's spelling out the consequences of the San Sebastian line, it's that Taggart Transcontinental is not going to recover from it, he thinks. Dagny thinks it will, but she's wrong, right? But also, it helped them to destroy the Phoenix Durango. Surely Dan Conway is the guy who earned his money, if anyone did, as far as we've seen it. And also, she asks, her coup de grace in trying to, convince him that he's wrong or there's something crazy is asking him, have you met Ellis Wyatt? Do you know who he is? And Francisco's answer is, sure, he's the one who's going to be destroyed next.
And he says he finds that much more amusing than the Mexican planners. So it might have been at first that he was out only to destroy people who get their money unproductively or something, but it sure seems like now his level of depravity has increased in some way, such that he's out to destroy even the best people. I mean, Wyatt is, by Dagny's view, by Conway's, by Eddie's, one of the best people in the country and the only hope of the country. Will, you had, hold on.
There was one which Lauren brought up in the spoilers group, even though it's not a spoiler, which I was also struck by. What does he mean? Why did he build the church securely? Because they'll need it. Was it just a cynical gesture? He doesn't seem like someone who makes gestures.
Yeah, so there's the question of he makes the claim, he's talking about all the things that are going to break in the San Sebastian, the community made for the workers, and he closes with, the church I think will stand, they'll need it. One commentator who is very critical of Rand and interpreted it as meaning we'll need it for all the funerals that they're going to have and all the accidents that are going to happen because of how broken everything is. That's not how I've ever interpreted that line. I've interpreted it like, in fact, they haven't got a prayer. All they could do now is hope and pray, and so the church is there for them to do it in. And in that case, it is, as you say, a kind of gesture or symbol. But I don't know that Francisco doesn't do that kind of thing. Ben?
And Greg, isn't it also important that we don't know at all that Francisco has actually made any decisions about which building gets built which way? He leaves it open to interpretation that, look, he just bought these mines and hired people to do all this stuff for him, and he didn't put too much thought into who was going to do it, but he knows that the money got wasted, and it just so happens that the ones who built the church didn't waste it as much for whatever reason. And there's a separate question you could ask about why that is.
It might be that it's an accident from Francisco's perspective. You're suggesting then that the church was the only thing that's well built, in which case Francisco is making a joke about that or something, and the joke is along the lines that we were just suggesting, but
right.
It's not part of his plan. All right, that's a possible interpretation. Mohammed?
Can I raise something about Jim, who we saw throughout the chapter as well?
Okay.
What do you think his attitude is towards Francisco, comparative to something like Eddie or Dagny? So just if we can just discuss that a bit.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Jim's attitude towards Francisco, especially as compared to Eddie in a way, because so Dagny is someone who's in this kind of competition relationship with Francisco. Maybe he's the first equal she's found, or maybe even more than an equal. That's not the case, and so maybe Jim, who's not displayed as having this tremendous ability that Dagny is portrayed as having even as a child, perhaps Jim isn't in a position to compete with Francisco. But then neither is Eddie, or by all that we can see. And they have very different attitudes. So Eddie is, in Francisco's way of thinking, one of the Taggart children, whereas Jim isn't, from very early. Now maybe Jim's attitude towards Francisco is a result of Francisco's attitude towards Jim, but I think it's not portrayed primarily as like that, right? Jim is what? Well, what do we know about him? He's wants to put down Francisco whenever he could. He's very often afraid to, or anyway unwilling to do it by talking to Francisco directly. So he'll often talk to Dagny about it. When Dagny is getting a bandage for Francisco, he, instead of making fun of Francisco or attacking Francisco, attacks her. You claim to be this strong, independent woman, but you're really not, the way you hang on everything he says. Why don't you shine his shoes, and so forth? To which she responds, I always like this line, because he hasn't told me to, not even asked me, so she's steering into the insult. Okay, so he's got something against Francisco. He sometimes later, after he's gone to college and learned some erudite vocabulary he thinks he can use to do it, tries to put Francisco down to his face, but usually he's off in the distance or saying things like, you think you could do it any better for riding the boat, which of course turns out he can. Whereas Eddie, tags along, becomes part of the endeavors, even when he's 4 years younger than Francisco. Jim is older, right? Jim's 3 years older than Francisco, I think. Why is Jim's reaction so opposite Eddie's? I don't think we really know, but it's where it comes from ultimately. But he seems threatened by him, maybe. He's angry or hurt, or he has a negative attitude. And the one real interesting contrast to me that we're given on this is between the way that Jim and Francisco laugh, that Dagny notices, that Francisco has a derisive laughter, or mocking laughter, but it's as though he sees something greater than what's around them. And so he can kind of put down things or mock them or make light of them by contrast to this greater thing that he's envisioning or looking forward to or sees as possible. Whereas in the case of Jim, he laughs as though he wishes nothing to remain great. And we'll have to see what we see of that in their characters going forward. But we now know that Jim also seems to kind of have issues with people who are great or very good at what they're doing. He hates Reardon, he hates Wyatt, he hates Dagny. Yeah, and Ben points out he doesn't like Eddie that much either. So it's not just sort of these rare people of great ability that he doesn't like, although he seems to particularly dislike them. It's interesting to think about what he doesn't like about Eddie, and we'll, I think, learn more about that as we go. I have one last...
And he doesn't even like his friends much.
Yeah, or his girlfriend, right? Will says that he... I took off my mic. Will says, and he doesn't even like his friends much, and that's true. He doesn't seem to like Orrin Boyle much, who he crowds out from the table. He doesn't like Betty Pope. He sleeps with her, then thinks about how awful she looks in her negligee, and so much better in the writing habits, and she doesn't want...
He doesn't like Wesley Mooch.
He doesn't like Wes... So here's an interesting little thing. How do you say that guy's name? Wesley, M-O-U-C-H.
I thought it was
Ouch.
I don't think that's an accident that it can be pronounced that way.
Irish?
I would assume that if it was real, and it would be derived from the French mouche, which is fly.
So I was told by an acquaintance of hers, and you guys might know this from being around the time, that she intended it to sound like a mixture between mouse and mooch. So mouch. But Allie?
Yeah, I heard it was supposed to be Mouch because there was a vaudeville act called the Mouch Brothers.
Ooh.
Huh.
That's interesting.
The Mouch Brothers. All right, so...
Was one of them named Moucho?
Harpo and Moucho Mouch. One other just Ayn Rand anecdote just connected to this chapter that I thought I'd share with people because it's not on record anywhere. So Francisco learned or played the stock market, and his father asked, when did you get the time to do that? And he says, while I was writing my thesis on the influence of Aristotle's doctrine of the unmoved or immovable mover on subsequent metaphysical systems. So a friend of mine who had been, and a friend and teacher of mine, Alan Gotthauf, who had been a friend of Ayn Rand's in her life, asked her, why that topic? And you might, read something into that topic, especially since we had a chapter, The Unmoved Mover, the last chapter. And her response was, she just wanted something really esoteric that you might write a thesis on that would really contrast with playing the stock market. So, one, I just say that here because it's a little piece of dicta that it's worth having on record. But also, when one's reading in and interpreting things, there's a danger of, finding special hidden meaning everywhere. You want to look and see what is the evidence for this, how much does it fit with a theory of the what's going on in the novel as a whole, and not every little thing like that has as specific meaning as you might read into it.
And
Okay, I think
Greg,
we're at about.
I was very disappointed to find that out because I thought that I had read that meaning into that choice, especially in this chapter where it's all about Francisco's purposes, his higher purposes, and his means to an end, and then he gets to the final end, and that's what the immovable mover is supposed to be. That for the sake of which everything in the universe moves. So I say, if whether she did this by accident or on purpose, the same element was present.
So the opposite of what Francisco says about the mind. If he had written the thesis on the immovable mover, I would have a hard time accepting that it's not on purpose, that it's there given the significance of it. But it's
Especially right after the chapter on the immovable movers.
Yeah, especially as Will and Muhammad say, when it's a chapter right after the immovable movers. But it's not on the immovable mover, it's on the influence of Aristotle's doctrine of the immovable mover on subsequent metaphysical systems. So it's like, what did Plotinus do with this? And it's still interesting. Alejandro says Ayn Rand always has a purpose on there. No accidental details, even she may not have known it all. So people are thinking she subconsciously had this symbolism, and I guess some people think that's true of artists. Okay, well, I think we are ready to call it a night. We went a little over, but we had some technical difficulties. And
we will continue to work on those. So pardon our dust, and thank you, everyone.
Yes. Bye, all.